Hey, this is Greg Johnson with Blue Book Services. I'm joined today by Jennifer McEntire, the food safety expert at United Fresh. And Jennifer, we had some big news about a pilot that you worked on with FDA about traceback and food safety. And before we get into that, I think it's really interesting that this is not your first experience with this group and doing pilots. You've been doing this for quite a while. So I would kind of like to know how much these pilots are improving, and is it making it quicker to turn this around into real world experiences and implementation?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Greg. As I think back at the pilots that we did when I was with IFT, this was under contract with FDA shortly after FSMA passed. So in that 2011, 2012, going on a decade, it is in some ways kind of frustrating to still be doing a pilot. But it is also interesting to reflect on what we did then, what we found then, and then how we approach these pilots today, knowing the experience that I had conducting pilots, and also how the industry has changed. So I think first, it's important to realize that when we did the pilots under contract with FDA, those that were, again, part of FSMA, required by Congress and FSMA, that FDA used some of the learnings of those pilots, I hope, to help craft the proposed rule on traceability that we see now. Those were opt-in pilots. So we had to have the full supply chains identified beforehand. We had to have the commitment from everybody in those supply chains. At that time, we focused on tomatoes and also on a processed food, a peanut butter type product. So there was naturally, inherently, I think, a little bit of bias in those pilots because people probably are not going to sign up for them to participate if they think they're going to do a terrible job. So we did those pilots then and certainly had learnings, observations that I think were quite valuable at that time. Here, the pilots that we conducted most recently were quite different in that the companies involved did not know that they were going to be involved. So we caught them off guard maybe a little bit sometimes. I and members of my team in the late spring went out and just bought product. We purchased actual romaine containing products and did the full documentation of the lot numbers, the receipts, kept our shopper cards, credit cards, stuff like that, and then contacted the company, which a few times we only knew the retail establishment where we purchased it from, didn't know what that full supply chain was going to look like. And it was still voluntary. So we said, hey, we purchased this product, we're doing these pilots, do you want to participate? Thankfully, most of the time they did say yes, but we had to uncover what that supply chain was. So in some ways, it was more similar to the process that FDA in the States use, not knowing how big, how small, who they're going to find, how complicated the supply chain is going to be. So a little more real to life, I would like to think, in terms of how we did the pilots today. In terms of the what's different, what's changed, we had a very specific charge when we did the pilots with IFT. We knew the scope of what we needed to evaluate. Here we had the flexibility and the freedom to do things our own way and leveraged those industry experts, those expert teams who kind of played the role of FDA, and charged them with figuring it out, do things better, ask whatever questions you think need to be asked in order to determine what was that purchase. So in the IFT pilots, we didn't have a real purchase. You know, we didn't have that receipt. And here we did, and wanted to know exactly, tell me what the lot number was. So I retained that even amongst the industry partners, the other associations. I did not share the photographs that I and my team had taken. And it was surprising to me. I did not expect that each of the three teams would be able to either determine the exact lot number of the product that was purchased or come within, have a choice one of two, and never missed it. always got it right. And I was not expecting that, given that in some ways the industry hasn't changed that much. It's not like 10 years ago, PTI didn't exist, and now everybody is scanning every PTI label. We've not, that has not been the extent of change that we've seen. So many of the systems, the reliance on purchase orders, bills of lading, just internal systems, that reliance is still there. But to see that these teams could ask questions in a different way and still get to the end goal, get to the answer, was very interesting to me.
Well, it seems to me like one of the pieces of good news out of this is that most of the data that has to be collected is already being collected and is easily providable by the industry. So on the flip side, what's the bad news? What's holding the whole system back from implementing this as soon as possible?
I think you're right, Greg, that these things can be figured out. So the data are there if you make a couple of assumptions and kind of start to triangulate things. So that takes time. It takes the business insight, that knowledge of how quickly is the product turning, at what time of day are shelves being restocked, when are orders being picked at the distribution center, and you can put the pieces of the puzzle together. So it is possible to do it today in a way that I think can be fine-tuned more so than the data dumps that companies will often give to FDA or to states when they're asked for, date range from most of the month. It's like, all right, here's all the data. We can do better today.
Right, because that just slows the process down, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's tons of paperwork to sort through. I've done it myself. It is laborious. Here in these pilots, we did ask all the participants to use a template to summarize the data. And so they had to have the data in the first place, which they did, although they didn't have complete data sets. So that's where you start piecing together timing and lot numbers and bills of lading and purchase order numbers. But again, with applying some insight into the process, you can do it. Would it be faster if at every restaurant, at every grocery store, you had the exact lot numbers for sale? Sure, it would be faster. And that's what we're basically seeing proposed in FDA's rule. But I think that there's a happy medium that industry can work with FDA and with states better. Even today, it's not going to be 4 years until the rule is really in effect. So we've got to use these 4 years to do better. And I think the pilots show that that's very possible.
So are you optimistic that there'll be some implementation of what they've learned from this quickly?
Fortunately, encouragingly, the companies that participated in the pilots, I think they kind of enjoyed it. They enjoyed being able to be a little bit more creative and applying more thought to how they were responding to the requests for information and the requests for data versus just a rote, okay, here's the records for 3 weeks, let me just photocopy them and turn it over. So I think that they appreciated being asked to think a little more critically about how their systems work. So for those participants in the pilots, which we only did 3, so it's not everybody, but I think for them I hope that it did stimulate some ideas on how they can provide better quality information to direct FDA and states toward solving the problem.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the analysis and expanding more on what we're learning from these pilots. And thanks for taking the time to talk with us and talk with our audience today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.